The second session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on January 25th. During that second session, the focus was on supplementing our perennial forage production with annual forages, many of which are considered cover crops, grown at strategic times throughout the growing season. In the presentation that follows, Al Gahler discusses what he and his colleagues have learned about growing a number of different annual forages for feed. Let's listen in as the host, Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff, introduces Al and his presentation on utilizing annual forages.
I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Certainly given some weather challenges we've had in making dry hay over the last several years. And we had a really unique opportunity in the northern part of the state in 2019, given a really wet spring and some prevent plant scenarios. So annual forages have really been a hot topic really since I've started my extension career. And Al Gahler from our Ag and Natural Resources Extension educator from Sandusky County has done a lot in the area of annual forages, dating back to just looking at the attendance list here, Al. I think there's some names you'll see maybe familiar from Fairfield County in your time there previously, and some of that annual forage work that you've done during your career. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Al Gahler to talk about utilizing annual forages.
All right, thanks, Garth. And I'm going to stop my video just to make sure we don't have any internet issues going on. And I'll bring my stuff back up as we get to the end and do questions. Hopefully all those guys that are on here from Fairfield County have had success with anything I may or may not have taught them back then. And if something went wrong, it was probably Stan's idea. So just keep that in mind, guys. All kidding aside, some of the stuff that I'm going to reference here, including a few of these introductory slides, go back to some presentations that Stan and I both put together way back when in early 2000s when I started my career. And kind of funny how things come full circle because annual forages were a hot topic back then as well. I started my career in Fairfield County in 2002, and that was a very dry year. All around the state of Ohio, and we were scrambling that year for annual forages. Fortunately, Stan had the foresight to have some things going before I even started at the office there in September of 2002, and my career in annual forage research was kicked off whether I wanted it to be or not, and it's worked out pretty good because I took a liking to that. I'm a beef cow calf producer myself, raise Angus cattle, and also a forage producer on our family farm here in Ottawa County. So all this stuff that I talk about, I have done it at home and continue to do at home. And that's one of the neat things about all this is I've got a lot of experience in it to answer those questions as well. And that's why I put up these first few slides here that hopefully some of you might not only get a chuckle out of, but also realize that we do in fact want you to try this stuff. And we have been putting together research efforts. I've been involved in it for 19 years now. There's obviously a few years in there that annuals were not quite as much of a hot topic. It just kind of goes in cycles, but we've been gathering data for years and years through producer efforts. A lot of this research has been done on farm. Some of it's been done on university farms, collaboration between educators, between farmers that grow the forage, as well as guys that feed the forage. So we want you to take all this information and do realize that some of it represents extremes. We've got some examples I may refer to where we've just had crazy good success with some trials and crazy bad success with other trials or on-farm situations. But we've learned a lot from all of it, and we've got a good set of averages and useful information you can utilize here tonight. And by all means, like this one here says, whatever you do, try this stuff at home. It's not like the warnings on the commercials for other stuff you might see in your evening television where they don't want you doing it at home. We absolutely want you guys to try this stuff. Call us, any one of us that are panelists on here, between Jason, Garth, and I, and Stan, and Christine, that have all worked together on all these forage trials and tried to duplicate efforts around the state to get the best data we can. So This next slide here talks about just the issue at hand. You know, we had the same kind of scenario back in 2002, and I believe Stan helped me kind of put together this slide back then as well of, you know, but it really hits home to me because raising cattle here in Northwest Ohio in the heart of row crop country, we don't have a lot of pasture as it is. A lot of southeastern and other parts of the state that have good grass, you know, kind of look at that 180 to 200 days a year that they can actually graze. Well, I look at 180 to 200 days a year that I'm actually feeding hay or some other type of feed stuff because we just don't have the pasture. But no matter what the situation, if it's a dry year, if forages are short, forages are too expensive, there are other options out there to get your cattle fed. And we've spent a lot of time figuring out what those are, how we can extend the grazing season or find ways of harvesting forages at a lesser cost than some other types of hay that we would have to either produce or purchase. But long story short, one thing that we joked about back in the early 2000s, and the same thing goes today, because as I told you, I'm a hay producer. I make a lot of acres of alfalfa and sell it all around the state to horse markets, sheep markets, dairy markets. Right now, given the current climate of the ag economy and the rising cost of feed, with the way the commodity markets have been, my best advice to a lot of you is to really take a hard look at things. And maybe you want to just get rid of the cows, buy yourself another baler, start selling your hay, and things might turn out a whole lot more profitable for you. But if you're like me, you enjoy producing cattle, and we can find ways to make that profitable and make it benefit and complement other aspects of our operation so that we can have diversified operations and make them all work all the way around. So with that, we're going to dive right into what we can do for other forage options, and utilizing cover crops has been a big topic, especially up here in Northwest Ohio for the last few years with the water quality situation and trying to protect our water resources. And we found ways that we can utilize a lot of these cover crops for more than just holding the soil and covering up the residue from our row crop production. We can make feed value out of them. This is a neat little chart here that just kind of gives an explanation. I think Christine may have used this before. If not, you'll see it from her again sometime in the future, I'm sure, as well. But all these cover crops that can be used in a grazing situation, and it lists the grazing value here, as well as the harvest value on basically what the opinion is of agronomists on how those crops can be utilized. And we're going to talk about several of these here tonight. This slide then is taken right out of the Ohio Agronomy Guide and shows you a lot of those same crops that were just pulled up on the last slide, and tells you what it takes to grow these. A little guide to look at this first column here tells you a seeding rate of pounds per acre if you're going to plant any of these individual crops, the ideal planting dates that are going to maximize both your quantity and your quality of that forage, and then tells you planting depth, nitrogen rates that are required to optimize that production, and it takes economics into mind, and we'll get into some of that as well. This next column here, where my cursor is, lists an expected tons per acre of dry matter yield, and keep in mind that is on a dry matter basis, and most of the stuff we'll talk about we'll refer to that way tonight. And then finally, it gives average readings of crude protein content and NDF readings or neutral detergent fiber on those crops as we grow them. So really handy chart available in that Ohio Agronomy Guide, which is available at your extension office or online through our e-stores, and something that every producer should have on hand. So as Garth alluded to, 2019, as most of you are aware, brought about a really interesting year with very little row crop production actually happening. So we had a lot of idle ground, prevented plant ground, and not only livestock producers were scrambling to try to figure out how they're going to feed their animals, but row crop producers as well, trying to figure out how can we make money, what can we do with this ground. And because of the change in restrictions to that prevented plant ground, we had all kinds of options and guys throwing bags of all kinds of things in the ground to try to grow some forages, either for their own use or to try to sell. So we reacted quickly and put together some trials that summer and did the old farmer approach. And we went to the back of the shop at the research station and found every old bag of whatever type of cover crop seed was available. And then we went down to the co-op and asked them for all their broken bags and whatever else they might have available that had not been scrounged up by producers. And we stuck them in the ground and said, let's see what happens. So what we did that predominantly Jason and I worked on at the North Central Station in Fremont, we did 2 different plantings starting on July 2nd, and then we did another planting on July 29th. And we planted all these species listed right here with our Great Plains drill out at that research farm. We put down 100 pounds of urea ahead of that drill at planting, regardless of the crop. We were just trying to do this in a very efficient manner and get stuff in the ground and see what happened. We planted into wheat stubble where we made just one single pass with a disc and a finishing tool pulled behind it to get that ground broke up a little bit and get these crops established. And then we just made observations and collected data throughout the year, compared it to some of our other ongoing annual research for a few of these crops, such as oats and some winter annuals. And we're going to share with you our story here of what we found out and what might work to help give you guys some additional options to get your cattle fed throughout the year. Here's the planting rates that we used on those cover crop trials. And this is just kind of what we ended up with by looking through the Ohio Agronomy Guide, talking to the seed suppliers for these different crops. And keep in mind, this was all put down through a drill. So even for corn and sorghum and some other plants that may be spaced a little more, we put them down through the drill. So they were grown at 8-inch spacing. And you'll see some of the results here shortly. And of course, just as 2019 started out as wet as could be, naturally, when we want to try to gather some good research data and find a way to utilize a lot of that otherwise idle ground all around Northwest Ohio and the rest of the state as well, it quickly turned to dry after our planting season was ruined, and we did not have a tremendous amount of rain, but we had enough to make the trials go. And interestingly enough, you'll see when I start talking about a replication of this trial that Garth was able to do over at the Northwest branch, just 40 or 50 miles from where Jason and I were working on this one. They were inundated with some rainfall right after the planting of those trials, which may have skewed some data a little bit that we'll talk about. But we did have adequate moisture throughout this trial, so we feel like we had some pretty good information, although some of it didn't come at just the right time to get, especially the second planting going right away. May have sat for a little while in some dry soil. But what I'm going to do now is walk you through each one of those species that we had in the trial and just kind of show you a little picture show, as well as what kind of results we got. And this might help you guys start to brainstorm what ideas you might be able to utilize on your own operations. So one of the crops that we included in the trial was soybeans, and we just took whatever bag of soybeans we could find. We didn't pay much attention to maturity or seed variety or anything along that line, or treatments. We just went ahead and used some stuff that was laying around and put it in the ground. And of course, if we were going to try to grow soybeans for forage, we could actually manipulate our crop a little bit through decision making on what variety and what maturity we would want to use to increase tonnage, and could have an effect on our nutrient content as well. But we put these in the ground, as you recall, on July 2nd, as well as July 29th. And we tried to schedule our harvest. We were shooting for 30 days apart on planting. And then we tried to harvest each planting as close to 60 days as possible. And Mother Nature dictated that a little bit. So we ended up at a 64-day harvest on the early planting and a 60-day harvest on the second planting. You can see very similar results in terms of yield. But protein content differed just a little bit there, with the earlier planting being a little bit higher in protein and a little bit higher in total digestible nutrients as well. And these are actual pictures at the time of harvest from these different crops. So you can see we did have plenty of weed pressure in these trials as well. We did not do anything significant for weed control other than a Roundup application prior to planting, but we still did get some significant weed pressure there. Next one is a crop that is probably a staple in the diets of many of your beef cattle, whether no matter what stage of production you're in. If you're a feedlot, obviously utilizes more of the grain. If you're a cow-calf producer, a lot of guys I know using some silage production. And we decided to include corn in this because, well, July 2nd is not too far off of when we could be planting corn for silage anyway. But we just thought, let's see what corn's going to do in this trial and see if we can't make some good tonnage. Now, obviously, putting down just 100 pounds of urea is probably not sufficient to try to grow a really good corn crop that's going to have extra protein in it, because it's not going to have enough nitrogen to build that protein. But nonetheless, we treated it the same. And you can see from here, we had 3.5 tons of a yield of dry matter on the early planted trial, just about half of that in the later planted stuff, even though that picture on the right does look like that appears to be a healthier crop, appears to be a taller crop, but it did not have the tonnage that we experienced on the earlier. However, you look at the protein content, as you would expect, that crop on the left from the earlier planting certainly did try to go into the production phase and shoot tassels out at a really small growth, small plant height. And we experienced much better protein content because of the relative maturity of that plant at harvest than on the later planted one. Next crop we decided to put in was wheat. And as most of you know, wheat is a cool season crop that we grow as a winter annual. So we did not really have high expectations for it, especially planted on July 2nd. We thought that maybe being planted in late July or around August 1st, as we've seen over the years on research, it might perform similar to oats, or at least give us some tonnage and some decent nutrient content. But that was certainly not the case in this trial in 2019, and we did not even get any harvestable information. Not enough data there to collect because it was very poor germination, pretty hot during that time frame for most of this to grow in July and early August, and just wasn't enough there to make use of. You can see we did have some canopy cover, but a lot of that is weed pressure and some crabgrass in there, and just not enough wheat to harvest. So no usable data off of the trial there. So you can scratch this one off your list for July or even early August planted forages for the future. Oats, however, as many of you know, we've done a lot more work with oats than many of these other crops over the past few years, and even dating back to those trials in the early 2000s in Fairfield County. That has been a really good crop, not only because it's easy to grow, but it's pretty readily available seed sources, does not require a ton of nitrogen. It's very adaptable to many soil conditions, a lot of benefits here, and we'll get into some of that more. But oats were included. The earlier planting yielded just a little bit more in terms of overall tonnage, which kind of took us by surprise, because in prior trials in the previous years, the earlier we planted the oats in July, it seemed like the poorer they did. But I think we hit moisture just right to get this July 2nd planting going. And we did very well compared to averages over the years at 1.35 tons. Just a little bit less tonnage on the July 29th planted oats, but same story as the corn. You can see the field on the right looks like a significant healthier crop. It was still in the boot stage at harvest. It had not headed out yet. And as a result, same kind of thing, but even a more drastic difference. You can see that we had significantly higher protein content here. And when we get into talking about the requirements for a beef cow here in just a few minutes, you'll see that we're far exceeding that and having plenty of nutrient there in terms of the protein side. TDN, total digestible nutrients, a little bit lower than some of the other crops for oats than the others, but still in a somewhat acceptable range as long as we can get those cows to consume enough of it if we get it harvested in the right manner.
Hey, Al, before you go,
yes, sir.
A whole lot farther, can you review the seeding rates real quick?
We sure can. Find my way back to that slide. So right here is the seeding rates that we utilized for this trial in 2019. The oats were put in at 80 pounds per acre. The rye and wheat also at 80 pounds. Soybeans, 90 pounds. Corn, 25 pounds. Pearl millet, 15 pounds. Peas were at 100 pounds. Teff grass was at 12 pounds. And I think I skipped over sorghum at 30 pounds.
Thank you.
Not a problem. Feel free to pull those questions up. If I don't see them pop up as I'm focusing on my other screen, Garth will definitely try to get my attention and get these. I just saw pop up. Are these protein rates on a dry matter basis? And yes, everything we're going to present here will be on a dry matter basis. And a lot of the information that we're going to talk about in some of the graphs we're going to see later is going to show you some more stuff on a dry matter basis as well. And all the stuff done at the same lab that we've utilized throughout the years to do our analysis. And if I can get my slides to advance, we'll get back to where we were. There we go. So rye was very similar to wheat production, and we didn't have high hopes for it, and it did not let us down in that regard, and we did not have anything harvestable there, so no data to show you from that. But we will have some information on winter annuals near the end of the presentation here in a separate trial that Jason and I have been working on also at the Fremont Research Station. So we will have some data on rye, but we did not get anything usable out of this summer trial in 2019. Sorghum, however, I know a crop that a lot of you guys have utilized in several different forms, whether it's brown midriff varieties, sorghum sedan grass varieties, a pretty popular crop to get beef cows fed throughout the year in Ohio. And this one, 2.4 tons per acre of a yield on the early planting, and just a little bit less than that on the later planting. And again, same story that we saw with the oats and the corn crop, where we had significantly higher protein, a little bit higher total digestible nutrients, and what we would expect to be a healthier looking crop, and giving us that better feed quality based on the relative maturity at plant or at harvest. So next one we're going to talk about is pearl millet, a crop that I know not a lot of guys are familiar with or have grown, at least on a regular basis, but I know a lot of people did try it, especially up here in Northwest Ohio during the summer of 2019. And as you can tell by the pictures, we believe that this is one very similar to corn, and that requires even more so than the sorghum sedan grass varieties, requires more nitrogen, and putting down 100 pounds of urea ahead of this planting was just simply not enough to make this crop what it could have been. We did have several producers that used pearl millet in settings at home, and upwards of 150 units of nitrogen instead of the 46 that we gave it did produce a decent crop. You can see only 0.7 tons per acre on the early planted stuff, and 1.6 tons on the later planted stuff. And again, same story, that we certainly had better growing conditions on that later planting, and experienced a higher protein content, although TDN did drop a little bit for us. But certainly one thing that we take away in our observations here is that if we're going to grow pearl millet, we definitely want to make sure that we have adequate nitrogen supplied, and it can still be very useful. One of the attractions to this crop, for those that are not familiar with it, is that in comparison to a sorghum crop or a corn crop, it's a much finer stem, smaller stalk, that if we do want to try to make dry hay with it, it is very suitable, and it is typically considered palatable for horses. However, if you are going to mix it in, one of my experiences with it in 2019 is we overseeded some weak alfalfa stands to try to get some additional tonnage, and it will look significantly different in the bale in terms of color and leaf shape, obviously, even after it dries down, shows up, and made some hay customers definitely question what we had going on, but the palatability was there, and it was very suitable, and did give a boost in production to some of those weaker fields. But again, same thing, even putting it into an alfalfa stand to try to boost that tonnage, probably needed some additional nitrogen to really maximize the use of that crop. Now we did hear from some people that used it that it does get kind of rough and leaf margins and a little bit rougher that way, even though it's still considered palatable. And I do know some horse producers that used it and said it was okay and their horses ate it okay, but it does have a little bit rougher leaf surface and could cause some palatability challenges there, depending on how we put it up. And we'll let Jason talk about more about that in detail tonight as he gets into proper ways to make baleage and how to harvest some of these crops and make them the best utilization depending on our harvest method. Another one that was utilized quite a bit in 2019 and a crop that is actually used almost every year in certain situations and some guys that really like to grow it is tough grass. And this one is another warm season crop, so we expected it to do fairly well during the summer. We experienced 1.15 tons, and this is just off of one cutting at that 64-day interval, and then 1.7 tons on the later planting on that 60-day interval, and right in line with what we typically expect on an annual basis for tough grass. This one can be a little bit harder to establish. You can definitely put this seed too deep into the ground, so you definitely want to pay attention to those recommendations from the agronomy guide as well as your seed supplier on how to plant it. We saw much better results. We had some teff that was planted outside of the working area for our trial that was in no-till ground, and that actually germinated a little bit quicker and came on a little faster than the teff did in the trial, where we had made that one pass with the disc and the finishing tool. And I think we simply got it too deep in the ground where the ground was worked and just didn't experience the early germination that we saw in the no-till situation. So it can be a little bit finicky to grow and establish, but if established well and given the right amount of nitrogen, this crop can produce a really good dry hay late in the summer. And most guys that utilized it back in 2019 got 2 cuttings, which took their tonnages well up over 2 tons per acre and had some very marketable hay then to put on the market for just about any class of livestock. And you can see on this one, very similar to the rest of the crops, we did increase the protein just a little bit with that second planting, and TDN pretty similar between the two of them. Not quite as high there, but a crop that is, if harvested right, high in digestibility and can work out as well. So now I'm going to roll over and talk about, I mentioned that we tried to duplicate some of these efforts all around the state back in 2019 to really get a good snapshot of what annuals can do all over the state. And so wherever we could, because we've got several of us in county offices and different research stations. Christine tried to grow some stuff down in southeastern Ohio. Garth tried to duplicate the efforts of Jason and I over at the Northwest Research Station, which is in Wood County. And obviously based on location and because we took what we described as the farmer approach to this, and we did not lay out every trial exactly the same with the same bag of seed everywhere. We took what we could find and what was left over because as you guys remember, the seed was being scrounged up all over the place and very tough to find for a lot of these species. So Garth was able to get a few things in the ground though at the Wood County location and used July 15th and August 5th as planting dates over there. Did the same thing that we had in Fremont and put down 50 pounds of nitrogen at planting. And then took forage samples and tonnage at 60 days of growth, looking at the same type of traits that we were analyzing. And here's what we found for results over there. And you can see what species they grew at the Northwest branch. They had a forage variety of sorghum. They had a brown midrib variety of sorghum. They had a non-brown midrib variety of sorghum. They included pearl millet as well. They included Italian ryegrass, and they included teff grass. And I think I've got another slide coming up that's going to show a few more species that we grew as well. But just glancing through this slide, and keep in mind, if I advance before you guys get a chance to completely digest all the numbers on here, this stuff is all going to be made available to you. so that you can print it off or make your own notes or whatever you want to do for reference as you go out and try to grow these crops and use them for the success of forages on your operation. But the seeding rates listed here across the top of what we planted. And you can see the percent dry matter at harvest. And the next column or row there is the yield in dry tons per acre. You can see upwards of 3 and close to 3 on most of the sorghum varieties. The pearl millet was 1.5 tons, very similar to the results we had at the Fremont station. The Italian ryegrass just under 1 ton per acre, and the teff just over 2 tons. Crude protein percentages, very similar as well. You can see the Italian ryegrass definitely brought in more protein than the rest of these crops. But the number we really keyed in on here was the NDF value. And having that number well below 50 makes this one a much more digestible crop that we can get those cows to consume more of, and so might be a good solution for us. And if we're looking at feed stuff that can do that. We look at the bottom column there. Those of you that may not be familiar with ash content, we did have some surprises throughout the growing season of high ash content in a lot of these crops, and that was mainly dependent upon the harvest situation. Ash is not desirable in our feedstuffs, and basically it is a reflection on how much dirt that we take in during the harvest process. And we can get to too high of levels of ash. On average, our alfalfa hay that's made in normal production situation will have somewhere around 5 to 6, sometimes 7 or 8% ash in it. We saw some readings in some of these crops harvested as high as 12 and upwards of 16% even on some of them, but we were not harvesting these in a typical manner as we might on farm, or especially like we would in a grazing situation. So we didn't read into it too much, but we did have some spikes throughout the season on some of the trials around the state that showed us just a little bit more ash than we were comfortable with being in our feedstuffs. Some observations from that part of the trial over at the Northwest Station in Wood County. As I mentioned early on when I started here, they were blessed with a very wet July, just like they had April and May over there. But a lot of it came in a very short window right in the middle of July there. And they had 4.2 inches of rainfall right after they planted this. Keep in mind, it was planted on July 15th for that first go round. And I had a very significant rain event right after that. And then throughout the next week with a collection of 4.2 inches total. So we think that did have a significant effect on the availability of nitrogen for the crops in the trial over there, and very well could have had a significant effect then on crude protein, because there simply was not enough nitrogen available for those crops to convert it into protein, which could have then gone into whatever class of livestock we chose to fed with those forages. As I had mentioned earlier, there may be some palatability concerns too, from what they noticed on the leaf margins of the pearl millet. And just looking in comparison at those different sorghums that they utilized in the trial over there, if you're looking at stem diameter and how we're going to process that crop and digestibility and so forth, that the forage sorghum definitely had greater stem diameter than the brown midrib, which was a bigger diameter than the non-brown midrib varieties. So just some interesting observations there that you might make note of and keep into account when you make your decisions on what plants you might want to utilize as an annual forage in your operations. On the August 5th plant date over there in the Wood County station, they included oats, they included triticale and cereal rye, and the seeding rates listed there on the top line. 87 pounds is where they ended up with the oats, 109 on the triticale and 109 on the rye as well. And you can see similar dry matter percentages at harvest. Yield about what we would expect for most of these crops in the fall at a 60-day harvest after an August planting. Just over 1 ton on the oats, a little bit more than 1 ton also on the triticale, and significantly less than that on the cereal rye. Crude protein content right in line with where we would expect to from what we've seen in other work in previous years. And same thing in terms of NDF and ash as well. So some good information there coming out of the work Garth was able to do in Wood County at the Northwest Station. And then what we did was try to compile information from all around the state on a forage crop survey and see what producers experienced, what we experienced at all the research branches all around Ohio, and put that information together and put it into a couple of really neat charts here that'll show you what we had in terms of ranges of tons per acre, what we had in terms of protein content for those that were able to sample and test their nutrients in their forages, and put together some neat averages. So you can see here, if you look at the top line of oats, the average around the state was 0.88 tons of dry matter per acre with an average protein content of 15.9. There's a few different mixes in here that were utilized: oats with peas, oats with radishes, oats with rye and turnips, which did have a significant effect on protein content versus just the oats. As you can see, the peas and the turnips definitely bringing that protein content up, but not necessarily improving tonnage. And I'm sure I don't have the information in front of me on seeding rates for all of these different mixes, but we can get that to you guys, as I'm sure some may have that question if they want to try to utilize some of these mixes in the future. And some other crops in there, some similar numbers to what we just explored earlier. Teff grass came in at a 1.93 average tons per acre around the state, with an average of 9.0 on the crude protein, and total digestible nutrients a range there as well, but an average overall of 42.8. And you can see corn down there, an average of 7.4 tons produced at a crude protein average of 6.8, and some variability there in the total digestible nutrients on the corn crop. Next slide is just going to show you more of the same, different crops around the state that we were able to collect information on. And all of this was, keep in mind, as it says here in the bottom, published in the 2019 eFields report. So if you have a copy of that laying around yet from the 2019 version, which would have come out last December, or a year ago December, or a year ago right now, has all this information in there and available to you. But you can look down and see the tonnages here for some of these other crops: the forage sorghum, the brown midrib, the sorghum Sudan grass, the pearl millet. And you can also then again compare those protein contents as you look through and see what we came up with from different crops utilized around the state. And here's just another way of looking at that, to put it in a graph format so you can kind of get a really quick snapshot without looking at the numbers individually. And this chart shows us the yield of these July planted forages with anywhere from 47 to 102 days of growth, depending on the crop and the harvest situation. All information we collected in those surveys. And you can see one giant gleaming difference here of how much more corn we were able to grow in terms of tons of dry matter per acre versus the rest of the crops. So one would probably glance at this chart, and if this was the only thing they saw from all of our results, think, well, I'm going to grow corn so I can have all that extra tonnage available for my cows. But there's a lot of other things we want to consider, including what are the livestock requirements for my class of livestock. And of course, I think we have mostly beef producers on here tonight, since we're in a beef program, but I know some of you may grow some sheep or raise some sheep as well. And we just included that information for reference, and we'll show you some interesting charts here with some lines in that'll represent these numbers on what requirements do we need to meet in terms of nutrients to make these crops suitable for these classes of livestock. And so for beef cow, we call the average 1,400 pounds, which I know a lot of herds out there might have a significantly higher mature cow weight than that, even though they may not realize it. But I certainly think that is the trend. And a lot of herds probably closer to 1,600 pounds on that average. But we need a dry matter intake of 1.7% with a total digestible nutrients of 50% and a crude protein of 7.1% for our normal mid-gestation beef cow to stay at a maintenance level and not lose body condition. When she's lactating, those numbers go up significantly. And we need to keep that in mind as we look into what we can do with these crops as well. So this chart puts those numbers into perspective for us by showing us the left-hand side is crude protein on a dry matter basis. And excuse me, the orange line at the top is our cutoff level for where we need to be for lactating sheep. The green line here through the center is lactating beef cattle. The red line is for maintenance on sheep. And then the dark green line is our maintenance for mid-gestation beef cow when she's at her lowest requirements for nutrients during the course of the year. So you can see and compare then which crops, and keep in mind, this is 1 year's worth of data. You can look and see which crops are going to be able to meet the demands that we need for our specific operations. And just use that as one more piece of our puzzle of trying to figure out what crop is going to best suit our operation and what might we be able to grow to cover some of that forage gap or supplement our hay supplies or our pastures. This next one shows that TDN, prior slide showing us the crude protein requirements, and we've got the same colors up here. So we're looking at the green lines for beef cows. The green line up near the 60 mark for TDN is where we need to be for that lactating beef cow. And then the dark green line for that dry beef cow in mid-gestation. And you can see again which crops, based on our 2019 information, we're able to attain the levels we need in terms of nutrient content, with most of them either at or very close to meeting those requirements. This slide, I'm not going to get into the individual breakdown because just wanted to show you though that there's one more piece of this puzzle besides figuring out which crop can grow us enough crude protein, which crop can put us where we need to be in terms of NDF levels so that we can ensure enough intake, and which crop can produce energy, which we haven't talked about enough yet. But finally, one of the magical pieces of the puzzle that Stan would be very disappointed if I didn't harp on a little bit, that we always talked about in my days back in Fairfield County, is it all comes down to dollars and cents, guys. We need to be looking at not only which crop can give us the most tonnage and which crop's the easiest for us to grow or the most convenient, but what can we do to improve our bottom line? And so we're going to further break these crops down by nutrient value and put a dollar sign on it, as we see over here. And as you can see in this slide, my counterpart, Jason, who's going to talk here the rest of the evening after I conclude, put this together using information from formulas and calculations they use in the dairy industry to really balance their rations. And what we came up with, we're going to show you on the next slide, is what we have for a nutrient dollar value on some of these crops as we grow them. And that is going to change how we look at things and put things into a little bit different perspective for us. So on that statewide survey, we put a per acre value to these July planted forages. And you can see on a per acre value, corn is still way up there. But we're going to show you a little more interesting information on the next slide, that the chart format is not going to be as detailed and give us quite the information that we're looking for compared to this style that's going to give us a breakdown on these. And we've got that line, remember corn showing it so high on the previous slide, is really not that much difference when we look at a nutrient value per ton of dry matter produced. So yes, corn's going to give us a lot of tons of dry matter, but there's a cost of production associated with that because we're going to need more nitrogen. We're going to have more expense in the seed. We may have more expense in the maintenance of that crop all around. Even though it still, in some cases, may be the most economical and makes sense for us because of our equipment that we have on hand if we're already normally producing corn silage. But we just want you to see that if you really study this chart, there's a lot of other crops that come in very similar ranges. And if we look at oats, it's not surprising that based on nutrient value per ton of dry matter is one of the better performing crops here. If you look at the high end, we've got $293 here for a corn soybean mix. Soybeans are really up there as well. But a lot of us also are not familiar with growing soybeans for a forage setting. Seed costs may be a little bit different. Crop maintenance may be a little bit different. And for not only those reasons, but a lot of other reasons, we have migrated towards some of the smaller grains over the last several years as an alternative forage because they may be easier for us to grow, less inputs, more economical, easier to harvest, easier to graze. So many different factors that have come into play. You need to make that decision based on all the factors we've discussed tonight to try to decide what's going to be the best crop to supplement your forage situation. And that may change from year to year based on what's going on. If you need to supplement pastures because it dried up, or if you need to supplement hay because you weren't able to produce enough, whether you lost access to hay acres, lost access to pasture, a multitude of reasons out there that we could be looking at annuals as a forage option. But some great information here in terms of what we can expect, not only on tons per acre in this column, but what we can expect for an average on crude protein, and then roll that over into what we can expect on a value of tons of dry matter produced of dollars per nutrients. So some really cool information. And if anybody wants to get into real good details, of course, you want to read all the fine print here because we are a university and research based, and there's definitely going to be some fine print that'll tell you kind of what goes into all these calculations. But that's stuff that whether it's Jason or Garth or I or any of us on the forage team or the beef team would be glad to discuss and go through on one-on-one situations with you guys to help you figure out how to come up with these calculations and how to utilize them on your operation to figure out that crop that might work best for you. But as I said, a lot of times we've leaned back towards those small grains, and specifically oat production has been a very popular one, probably the most utilized crop for annual forage in Ohio, at least in my part of the world and with what I'm aware of from talking to other educators. So we're going to give you just a little bit more detailed information here as I get close to wrapping things up tonight to let you know kind of what we've experienced. And of course, you've already seen this slide once, but I'm going to show you some more detail on some of our oat production from our trials. And we've been working over the past several years to not only figure out when is the best time to plant these oats to maximize both quality and quantity, but we're also trying to determine what is the ideal nitrogen rate. It, again, will help us maximize that quality and quantity. Here you can see from our 2019 study alone that we applied three different rates of nitrogen. We used a 0 rate, and we used 100 pounds of urea, which gave us 46 units of nitrogen, and 200 pounds of urea, which gave us 92 units of nitrogen. And you can see not statistically significant in the difference there, but a slight difference in overall tonnage, just over 1.4 versus just about 1.3 for the lower rate of nitrogen. And what we do learn from this is we know we have to supply some nitrogen. We cannot put this crop out there and expect it to give us a return on our investment without any nitrogen. And again, this was July 15th planted, harvested at 60 days. So that was the yield information. What about the nutrient content? Well, you can see in the two separate lines here for each one, again, we've got our high unit, 92 units of nitrogen. In the middle, we've got our 46 units, and on the right, we've got 0. The blue column represents a 45-day harvest after planting. The red column represents a 60-day harvest. And just as you would expect, as that crop matures, as most of you know, it's a grass plant. As we get more maturity to it, it is going to drop in nutrient content. But remembering back to those values that we discussed for what a beef cow needs, we're still definitely suitable here, but there is definitely a difference in that harvest date as well as the nitrogen rate that we can see. And keep in mind, again, 1 year of data here. We intend to continue to study this and gather information and values that we can compare several years worth of data and try to make some statistical sense out of all of this so we really get some good answers going forward that you guys can utilize. This one looks at the TDN values at both that 45-day harvest on the left, the 60-day harvest on the right. And again, your 3 different nitrogen levels, with blue being the high rate, red being the middle rate, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of what we would expect to be realistic and economical for most situations. And then the 0 rate on the right. And you can see that there was a statistically significant difference amongst the three of them at the 45-day harvest. No statistical difference as indicated by the letters at the top on the 60-day harvest between the two higher rates of nitrogen. One other thing we have discovered over the years, and any of you that have grown oats will know this as well, but oats do tend to get an effect from crown rust at some point during the season. If we plant them, whether we plant them in July or early August, they always seem to be susceptible. Some varieties may be a little bit different than others. What we utilized here in the trials at the North Central Research Station was just simply feed oats that had been triple cleaned and were coming right out of the feed supplier at the local co-op. So they were not a forage oat variety. They were not anything that was anything special, just your run-of-the-mill oats that you can get for feed from any of your local co-ops around the state, probably all sourced from Canada, as most of them are. But what we've learned over the years is that there is definitely an effect from crown rust, and we wanted to see statistically, is it having an effect on yield? Is it having an effect on nutrient content? And so we started to look at, along with our planting date and nitrogen rate trials, incorporating the treatment with a fungicide. And I have not listed the fungicides that are available because that is a tricky question depending on who you talk to. Some agronomists and others would say that we have to use a fungicide that's labeled for forage oat production, but you're not going to find one. So what we've done is utilized fungicides that have been labeled for other forage production because we're not raising these as a grain crop. We're raising them as a forage. So we've gone and looked at different modes of action in these fungicides and used ones that we determined acceptable by label to utilize for a forage production situation. And you can see not only in the previous picture, but in this one, on what the effect was of that fungicide in the crown rust. And surprisingly, it may not have as big of an effect on nutrient content as you might think, but there is some effect that we have noticed. And one thing that I can tell you from experience as a farmer also utilizing these is it definitely affects palatability. Cows will tolerate a certain amount of rust and they will still run you over to get to a wet wrapped bale of oats most of the time, but they do start to back off once we get severe infestations of that crown rust. So here's a look at yield with the different nitrogen rates and the fungicide treatment. So these three on the left were the treated portions of the trial. The three readings on the right were the untreated, and kind of what you would expect there, that you see a little bit of an increase in tonnage where we did treat with a fungicide regardless of the nitrogen rate. And this slide I know gets a little busy and shows you a nice rainbow, but it puts all this information back together in one spot. So on the left where my cursor's at here shows us the crude protein, and it shows just like the previous slide. On the left we have the treated. So this is the blue column is the treated oats at the higher nitrogen rate. The red is the treated with fungicide at the average nitrogen rate, and the green is treated with a fungicide with 0 nitrogen. And so here's our difference in improved protein contents. And if you see a different letter at the top, that means it was a different statistical category. So there was a significant difference. Then same thing with the NDF. It's the treated and then the untreated on the right with those same colors. And you can see the NDF values, all very similar, very little statistical significance in terms of difference there, whether we treat it or not. And the TDN, as you'd expect, hopefully just a little bit higher with the treated portions. Regardless of nitrogen, we see a little bit increase there in the total digestible nutrients with the treated versus the untreated, and similar steps and values for that nitrogen rate as well. And then in terms of energy, very little difference there in terms of looking at the graph. But again, if you look at these indicators for the statistical analysis on top, we did have statistically significant difference in energy content as well on the treated versus the untreated. So we do know that fungicide will have an effect. What needs to be studied and determined yet is where the economics come into play on that, and what can we expect in yield versus return on that investment, as well as nutrient content of the fungicide. So that's something that'll play into our future look at things, and you can do some of that own math on yourself. You guys know that fungicides can be expensive, but there may be a place for them in at least doing some side-by-sides at home so that you can see the effect in 1 year of untreated versus treated. I'm going to conclude with just a real quick snapshot at our winter annual trials. And if Jason has time and wants to get into any more detail on these, he may be able to do so. But we've also started to take a look at winter annuals. And although we're not going to look at planting date like we did with the summer annuals or the cool season stuff, planting in August, what we're looking at is trying to discover what winter annuals might be useful for an annual forage. And we used wheat, triticale, cereal rye, and a hybrid rye. And what we did is planted them all just as soon as we could after a soybean harvest in the fall, and then evaluated those plants in the spring at different stages of growth. So you'll see at the bottom here, the growth stage was 10.0 for the first 4 columns for wheat, triticale, cereal rye, and hybrid rye. And then the same 4 plants again at 10.5 growth stage, so that we could see the difference in both tonnage and nutrient content, as the next slide will show. And this is the average yield. So we're approaching 2 tons per acre here on the triticale at the later growth stage at harvest. So at the 10.5, these were the head coming out of the boot, and these were still in boot stage at the 10.0 stage of maturity. What effect does that have on protein content? Well, obviously, as you would expect, just like in any other grass crop, as we've already discussed, you're going to see a higher protein content when they're harvested in the boot stage before heading. And we're going to see a little bit of a drop in that as we allow that crop to mature and take a different snapshot of it at a further maturity. And then moving right along, just as we did with the other crops, taking a quick look at the NDF and what it does to the fiber content over the extended time to allow that crop to mature more. And just as we would expect, the NDF is also going to go up, making that crop less digestible the more mature it got. And then finally, a look at the energy expressed as total digestible nutrients. And again, same thing. We definitely have higher nutrient content and better content in terms of energy as TDN on that plant at an earlier harvest date and an earlier maturity. And then we put all those numbers together for you in one convenient slide. So the top 4 lines show us the earlier harvested at the 10 growth stage and then the 10.5 growth stage. And you can analyze this slide as we get you this information to really sit down and digest those numbers. But I'm not going to have much more time this evening to go through any of that, or I'll be cutting into Jason's presentation and too much into your evening. And then finally, as a quick reminder here, we saw this slide at the very beginning of the presentation. All this information is available to you in the Ohio Agronomy Guide, helping you to decide which plant or species you might want to grow in your operation. And all of them have a list of seeding rates that are recommended, planting dates that are recommended, planting depth, nitrogen rates, and then expected dry matter yields and protein content yields.